The ink on the German surrender documents wasn't even fully dry yet when Winston Churchill sat in his underground war rooms, puffing heavily on his trademark cigar and staring intensely at a map of a completely devastated Europe. Because while millions of exhausted people were joyously dancing in the streets of London to celebrate the end of the worst conflict in human history, the British Prime Minister was secretly ordering his top military generals to draft a highly classified plan for a massive, surprise military strike directly against the Soviet Union. Instead of letting the bleeding world finally take a breath after 6 years of unimaginable slaughter, Churchill was obsessively consumed by the terrifying realization that the massive Soviet military machine had essentially swallowed half of the European continent whole. And he genuinely believed that the absolute only way to stop Joseph Stalin from marching his millions of battle-hardened troops all the way to the coast of France was to immediately launch a preemptive offensive utilizing British, American, and, incredibly enough, rearmed German Nazi soldiers. It sounds like the absolute height of political madness, the kind of deranged alternate history you would only expect to find in a cheap dystopian novel. But this was a very real, highly classified operational blueprint codenamed Operation Unthinkable. And it brought the exhausted remnants of the world horrifyingly close to turning the dying embers of the Second World War directly into the radioactive fire of the Third. To truly understand how the celebrated hero of the British Empire reached such a profound state of geopolitical paranoia, we have to rewind the clock just a few months earlier to the lavish but tense atmosphere of the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, where the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, were casually carving up the post-war borders of the world while drinking heavy amounts of imported liquor and making grand diplomatic promises that absolutely nobody at the table actually intended to keep. Churchill had originally dragged his empire into a devastating war in 1939 for the specific, stated purpose of defending the national sovereignty of Poland against aggressive German expansion. Yet as he sat across the table from Stalin at Yalta, he was forced to watch the Soviet dictator smile warmly through his thick mustache while methodically ensuring that Poland would simply be transferred from the brutal grip of Adolf Hitler directly into the suffocating authoritarian embrace of the expanding Soviet Empire. The British Prime Minister left that conference feeling a deep, gnawing sense of historical betrayal and personal guilt. Realizing with mounting dread that they had sacrificed millions of lives to destroy the fascist monster in Berlin, only to inadvertently feed the entire eastern half of Europe to the communist monster in Moscow. And this dark realization began to completely ruin his sleep, driving him toward the desperate conclusion that negotiating with Stalin was nothing more than a naive and incredibly dangerous illusion. Driven entirely by this dark and unrelenting conviction, Churchill completely bypassed all of the standard diplomatic channels and went straight to the brilliant minds of his joint planning staff, dropping an absolute geopolitical bombshell on Brigadier Jeffrey Thompson, who was suddenly handed a top-secret directive demanding a full, comprehensive military strategy to forcibly impose the will of the United States and the British Empire upon the Russian military forces. You really have to appreciate the sheer, unadulterated shock that must have been running through the British military high command at that exact moment, because these veteran officers had just spent the last 4 grueling years fighting a desperate war of survival alongside the Red Army, constantly praising Soviet sacrifices in the public press and coordinating massive global strategies with them. And now their unpredictable prime minister was aggressively demanding that they calculate exactly how quickly they could stab their most powerful ally in the back before the thick dust of the collapsed Reichstag in Berlin had even settled to the ground. Thompson and his dedicated team of strategists essentially locked themselves inside their smoke-filled offices, desperately crunching the logistical numbers and analyzing the battered infrastructure of Europe, trying to figure out how to successfully execute an unprovoked continental offensive that was scheduled for the shockingly close date of July 1st, 1945. Giving them barely over a month to physically prepare for the largest and most audacious military betrayal in modern history. As the military planners dug deeper into the terrifying realities of Operation Unthinkable, the logistical requirements became increasingly absurd and morally compromising, primarily because the Allied forces currently stationed in Western Europe simply did not possess the overwhelming raw manpower necessary to successfully take on the colossal, unstoppable juggernaut of the Soviet war machine, forcing Churchill's planners to officially propose something so unbelievably toxic that it would have permanently destroyed his historical legacy if it had ever leaked to the international press. To somehow make the mathematical equations of war favor the British. The top-secret battle plan explicitly called for the immediate recruitment and rearming of up to 100,000 captured soldiers from the German Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. Taking the exact same fanatical men whom the Allies had just spent years desperately trying to destroy for committing unimaginable atrocities, handing them back their rifles and tanks, and sending them directly back to the Eastern Front to fight shoulder to shoulder with British and American boys. The dark irony of this situation is so incredibly thick that it almost defies belief, as the grand, noble crusade against European fascism was preparing to casually morph into a highly cynical military partnership with those exact same defeated fascists, all for the desperate geopolitical goal of violently pushing the sprawling Soviet front line back to the pre-war borders of Poland. While Churchill was comfortably sitting in London dreaming of a glorious, coordinated armored spearhead violently crashing through the surprise Soviet defensive lines to liberate Eastern Europe, his top military advisor, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, was staring coldly at the unforgiving mathematics of the proposed battlefield, and realizing with absolute certainty that launching this surprise attack would be the exact equivalent of committing national suicide for the British Empire. Brooke had the incredibly uncomfortable task of sitting down and carefully explaining to the highly enthusiastic Prime Minister that while the combined Allied forces could optimistically muster about 47 combat divisions for this surprise summer offensive, they would be slamming headfirst into a massively hardened, ruthlessly battle-tested Red Army that currently possessed roughly 170 combat-ready divisions across Europe, completely and utterly dwarfing the British and American forces in terms of heavy tanks, mobile artillery, and raw, expendable manpower. The Soviet soldiers holding that line had just violently clawed their way through the frozen ruins of Stalingrad all the way to the burning streets of Berlin, surviving the absolute most brutal, unforgiving meat grinder in all of human history. And they were certainly not about to be intimidated by a hastily organized Allied offensive, meaning that any initial element of tactical surprise would rapidly evaporate, and the conflict would instantly bog down into a horrifying, apocalyptic war of attrition that the exhausted Western powers simply could not afford to fight, let alone win. Even if the British military somehow miraculously agreed to completely ignore the suicidal mathematics of this monumental madness, there remained the massive, unavoidable problem sitting across the Atlantic Ocean, because the recently sworn-in American President Harry Truman was entirely focused on finishing the incredibly bloody, island-hopping campaign in the Pacific Theater against the fiercely resilient Empire of Japan, and he had absolutely zero political or personal interest in sacrificing hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in a brand new European slaughter merely to satisfy Winston Churchill's obsessive geopolitical fixation on the fate of Poland. Furthermore, the American military command was deeply relying on Stalin's promised commitment to eventually declare war on Japan and invade Manchuria to help relieve the pressure on American forces, making the idea of suddenly dropping bombs on Soviet tank formations in Germany not just strategically counterproductive, but borderline insane from the perspective of the grand global strategy that the United States was trying to carefully execute. When the Joint Planning Staff finally delivered their completed, highly detailed assessment of Operation Unthinkable to Churchill's desk on May 22, 1945, their final conclusion was incredibly blunt and entirely devoid of any comforting military optimism, stating absolutely clearly that a quick, limited tactical success was practically impossible, and that choosing to aggressively engage the Russian military would inevitably lead to a total, protracted global war that would drag on for untold years, essentially guaranteeing the complete destruction of whatever broken fragments were left of the civilized world. Churchill sat in the quiet solitude of his office, reading the terrifying, uncompromising report, realizing with a heavy, sinking heart that the incredibly narrow window of opportunity to dramatically reshape the map of Europe was rapidly closing forever, as his grand, desperate vision of a heroic military campaign to permanently save Eastern Europe from the iron grip of Stalin slowly dissolved into the deeply uncomfortable reality that Great Britain was functionally bankrupt, its population was thoroughly exhausted, and its military was completely incapable of initiating another global conflict without the unconditional support of the United States. As the proposed invasion date of July 1st eventually came and went without a single artillery shell being fired in anger, the deeply fatigued British public unknowingly stepped in and decided Churchill's ultimate political fate for him, voting the legendary wartime leader out of office in a completely shocking, landslide election defeat just weeks after he had successfully guided them to victory, abruptly removing his hands from the levers of military power before he could attempt any further drastic maneuvers against the Soviet Union. The explosive, highly incriminating documents detailing the sheer audacity of Operation Unthinkable were quietly and quickly shoved deep into the darkest, most secure government vaults in London, intentionally hidden away from the prying eyes of the global public, the relentless curiosity of historians, and the intensely paranoid intelligence networks of the Soviet Union. Because acknowledging that the beloved British bulldog had actively wanted to ally with recently defeated Nazi forces to launch a devastating sneak attack on a crucial allied nation was a massive public relations nightmare that the government wanted permanently and irrevocably buried in the ashes of the war. It wasn't until the late 1990s, nearly half a century after the dust had supposedly settled on the Second World War, that these shocking, deeply uncomfortable papers were finally declassified by the British government, allowing the modern world to finally see just how incredibly close human civilization had stood on the absolute, terrifying precipice of complete and total military annihilation in the hot summer of 1945. Driven entirely by the sheer will, the lingering guilt, and the overwhelming geopolitical paranoia of one singular man who genuinely believed that the only possible way to secure a lasting global peace was to immediately and ruthlessly start the deadliest, most destructive war that humanity had never seen.